Hello, everyone, and welcome to Doors to Success, a podcast dedicated to helping newcomers to Canada unlock doors related to volunteering, extracurriculars, and jobs. My name is Malik.
And my name is Mohammed.
Before we start today's episode, we wanted to ensure that we mention the trigger warnings and mentions of suicide in the podcast today.
Mental health as an immigrant is a challenge that many of us have to take on by ourselves due to cultural stigma, lack of resources, as well as fear of being seen as weak.
This episode is a tribute to Jay, who is the co founder of Doors to Success and a friend of mine. His memory and passion for immigration rights and providing resources for newcomers will always be a key point in the development and growth of the podcast.
That being said, today we discuss our own personal experience as immigrants in hopes that people out there who might be struggling can find comfort in relating to us or gaining a new perspective on life as a teenage, ethnic, first generation immigrant.
Now, Mohammed, I know that in many ways you can relate to a lot of male immigrants, especially ethnic first generation immigrants. And being an Arab male, I think that it comes with a lot of benefits, but also a lot of drawbacks and setbacks that contribute or, in a sense, decrease your mental health because there's a stigma surrounding you being a male Arab. So, that kind of just leads us to the first question. And what mental health challenges have you faced as a male Arab immigrant?
Yeah. I think that really, the central concept that underlies many of this, or many of these issues, is toxic masculinity. I think that unfortunately we don't like to talk about the concept of toxic masculinity as much within immigrant communities, although it is something that is brought up, and it is something that is spoken about through feminist theories, through all that stuff, and that is something that is a really deep and ingrained issue within our society as a whole. But I think it's even more so of an issue in, unfortunately, many immigrant communities. And I'm speaking about that as a sort of from experience, in a sense, right? Sometimes it's, oh, like, I'm tough, right? I don't have to deal with mental health issues. I'm fine. Yeah, I don't need to talk about my emotions. Oh, okay, you're not a man enough if you're showing your emotions, or not a man enough if you're crying, or you're not a man enough if you're doing this or that. And sometimes people even start referring to others using homophobic language, or et cetera, right? So all these are issues that unfortunately exist in many immigrant communities that I, as an immigrant, as a first generation immigrant, did observe myself, and that a lot of people don't talk about enough, unfortunately. So I think that really a lot of these issues stem from that. And sometimes I didn't feel, let's say, a lot of motivation talking about my own mental health struggles, or some of the stuff that I thought about on a daily basis, because it's like, well, who am I going to open up with? Right? Is it going to be a friend of mine who really doesn't believe that mental health is a thing that, let's say, brown people or immigrants should really think about, because it's only, oh, white people are the only ones that go to therapy or that should talk about mental health because they have time to talk about it. And that unfortunately happens to be the case with how people perceive mental health and perceive therapy and perceive other stuff of that sort. So I think that, there should be more of a discussion around that, especially in immigrant communities. I think that, me personally, I did find a lot of struggle just talking about these issues. And, sometimes I'd struggle and it'll just be silent struggle almost, because I wouldn't find that avenue to talk to someone about the stuff that I think about on a daily basis. And I think that the issue really starts there. It starts with toxic masculinity, starts with the perception of mental health in immigrant communities. It even starts with the language that we use with each other, how we listen to each other, the type of empathy that we show one another, right? If we're not empathetic enough, if we don't go like, well, I understand you, I hear you. Phrases as simple as that are unfortunately not very common amongst guys and amongst males, and especially in immigrant communities. Sometimes we don't think about the importance of that, because it's like, oh, you got to grind. You got to make sure that you actually earn your living, because at the end of the day, we got to also admit, right? Immigrant communities, unfortunately, in disproportionate ways, do face economic issues and things of that sort. And in a way, it's almost like you're almost in a constant mode of fighting against the odds. And I think that's really what it comes down to, right? the narrative and the rhetoric that surrounds mental health in immigrant communities.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a lot of great points, especially the whole idea behind the struggles that immigrants go through and having to go through that without being able to talk to someone and have someone that you can kind of refer to, whether it's a friend, but you're not sure if they're going to relate to you. So having that outlet, definitely, I think that like being able to talk to someone or having something that you can do, and from my perspective, I know that unfortunately the stigma and toxic masculinity they draw you away from talking to someone because of how you've been socialized as a man. And speaking from a woman, I think that like even as a person going through and talking to someone that's not very encouraged, like it's yeah you should go and talk to someone like you need help like that sort of thing like but if you talk to someone, it just feels like they're gonna start judging you with how you feel,
Yeah.
or
It's
they're
always
gonna
like, oh yeah, no, are you just trauma dumping to me right now? Like
yeah,
it almost turns into that because it's like people just like, oh, friends shouldn't be trauma dumping to, and I've heard that so many times. I'd be like, oh, oh God, I hated my friendship with that. But they would always trauma dump. They would always trauma dump. And I heard that from people talking about like friends, for example, or just acquaintances or
yeah,
whatever it is that they're trauma dumping. And of course, it's understandable. People might have issues in their lives and they're like, I already have enough on my plate. I don't want to listen. But like sometimes acts as easy as listening to others. And yeah, I'm sure many, some who are listening to this podcast might even know what I'm talking about here. But sometimes asking a person if they, let's say, are telling you about a life problem, if you ask them, well, are you venting or are you consulting me or are you asking for help or are you trying to get my opinion on it? Because someone might just be talking to you and they just want you to be that ear that's going to listen to them, right? Or someone might be talking to you and asking you for a solution or your
yeah,
opinion on a problem. And things as simple as that can make a huge difference. And
yeah,
unfortunately, we don't talk about these simple strategies enough, especially again within immigrant communities. That unfortunately happens to be the case.
yeah, exactly. And um, there's always this thing where like even with my friends or people that I'm talking to, I don't want to be like, oh, and then I start going off on a tangent on how bad my day was or like
Mm,
certain bad things that happened to me, and I'm like, oh, sorry, I'm gonna trauma dump right now. Are you okay with that? So it's like, I have to apologize
yeah.
before I start saying things about my day. And it's like, okay, like, with people I'm really comfortable with, I even do that sometimes. Like, if I'm comfortable with someone and I don't want them to like be annoyed with me talking about certain things that happened during my day, I'm just like, okay, are you ready to take all this in? Because like, it's either you're gonna be like really sad, I don't know how you're gonna react, like, or you're gonna give me advice. But sometimes like you mentioned some people don't need advice, they just need someone to talk to. And like um fortunately I've been sort of like I've been able to talk to people, but some people don't have that, or they're not comfortable with talking to someone in person or face to face or whatever it may be, so they have other outlets. And I think that like even you mentioned the whole idea of not being able to talk to someone. So how did you kind of um, undergo these mental health pressures or challenges, and what did you do? What was your outlet?
I think that my outlet has mostly been good friends, good support systems that surround me. I think that just talking to people, that is really where it goes, right? Just talking to people. And I think that sometimes people do find it quite challenging because again, you might not be surrounded by a group of people that are as supportive of you as you would like to be, right? That unfortunately happens to be the case. And in many ways, it just becomes a challenge, right? Because you're
100%.
like, oh, well, wait a minute, right? Am I gonna really be able to, tell them about my problems? If I tell them, are they gonna hate me? Are they gonna be like, well, that guy, here he goes again, talking about whatever it is that's happening in his life? And I think that you should, of course, some people do find it difficult to make friends. But at the same time, if you're also selective about the types of people that you have in your life and know that they're going to be supportive of you during these difficult moments, and them knowing that you're going to be supportive of them during difficult moments that they might face in their life, then maybe using that approach is very, very, very important. Right? Because at the end of the day, having a support system is where it all lies.
Yeah.
Right? We might be like, well, I can use sort of self-empowerment strategies, or I can use diary writing or journal writing or whatever it is. These strategies are all great, but human beings are social animals, and that's where it is. That's simply where it is. And of course, that does not necessitate that someone who has a social support system will be totally fine. It does not necessitate that, right? People might have a huge support system and also end up going into very bad patterns of thinking, or kind of self-harm, or even things as far as suicide, and that unfortunately happens to be the case. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? People might have support systems that also are supportive of them, right? That also are there to help them out, to listen to them, for them to talk. So I think that having a support system where that people in that support system are supportive of you and that they're actually going to listen to you during these difficult times is where it all matters. And investing into creating these support systems is where one's efforts should really lie.
I think that your mention of support systems definitely is something that a lot of people use as a way to cope with these mental health challenges. And I think that we also need to start thinking about you kind of touched on the point that I'm about to bring up, but the whole idea of why did they get to that point where they're now thinking of self-harm, or what are the things in their daily life that like are leading them to that. And I think
Mm.
that a lot of these issues aren't really touched upon. What is really being dealt with right now is when someone gets to that point. Like, okay, we're just gonna leave them there, like we're not gonna do anything to kind of ensure that they're in a place where they feel safe and they can talk to someone, or they want to actually do things with their life rather than thinking of self-harm and having to not want to talk to anyone because they feel that they're going to be judged, or it's just the whole environment of certain things that are you're supposed to deal with in your daily life, like school, work, and whatnot. So it's just the whole idea of like we think about help phones and certain things like that. Like, yes, they're out there for people, but who really uses them,
Right,
and who really goes to a help phone when they're feeling bad? Like, we
right,
have to start
right,
thinking
right,
about
right.
ways to support people before they get to that point,
Exactly, exactly,
before they start
exactly.
having to refer to someone to talk to, because it's come to the point where, okay, yeah, here's a help phone, here's certain things that you could do, we're just going to leave you there for a little while, and then you're going to have to refer to a help phone because you got to the point and we kind of didn't care about you for a little bit, but now we care about you because we don't want you to do
No,
anything to yourself,
we
and
don't
we don't
want
want
you
to
to
be
die. So,
responsible.
like, it's really fascinating because I think that also touches upon the central issue that exists in our system, which is that we're very focused on treatment and we're not focused enough on prevention. Right? I think we do not have
Yes.
measures in our system. Yes, it's like our healthcare system. Preventative care is not a thing that the healthcare system invests much into. Even mental health care systems, right? And I think it's even worse with mental health care systems because we do not invest much into preventative care, but we do make quite significant investments into treatment. Facilities like CAMH or other facilities, or things like the help phone, for example, suicide hotline, all these things, right? Yeah, there are things that are there to make sure that you don't die,
Yeah.
but really, how do we even prevent that from happening, from people
Mm.
even getting to that point?
No.
Is what it is. And
There's
I think that,
nothing there. It's
yeah,
literally
it's
nothing.
literally nothing, right? That,
Literally
oh yeah,
nothing.
if you're lucky enough to grow in an environment that's going to be supportive of you, where you don't go into negative patterns of thought, where you're this, where you're that, then you're going to be less likely to go into patterns of things like self-harm or suicide or whatever it is, right? So, well, okay, so then that gets us to the basic point, which is, well, are we really accounting for the privilege that some people might have and others might not? And are we really trying to set like an even playing ground for people? Right? Is our system focused on preventing that from happening? No, it's not. And I think that that really gets us to the main issue here, which is that our system at its core does not care about prevention,
No.
unfortunately.
No, it's literally in everything. It's in the socioeconomic, how the socioeconomic statuses are kind of like separated. We're seeing more of a shift towards like, oh, this person is really, really rich, and then we have like on the other side of the spectrum, like completely unable to fund basic things like food, and so it's like you can't find a middle ground in these
Yeah.
certain things
Yeah.
that are really the main reasons why people are thinking of, they get to the crisis where, oh, okay, let's actually deal with it now,
Yeah.
like, okay, oops, we don't want to be responsible for, you harming yourself. So we want to
You
make
know?
sure that you're still alive. So please don't die. Here are some help phones that you
Yeah.
could use. Like, it's really not like it just, it's really sad to see that we only start doing something when it gets to the
Yeah.
point where it's
It's
like
just reactive.
extreme.
It's not proactive.
No,
It's
it's not.
reactive. It's a very reactive system.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads us to a question that I thought of that really relates to a lot of what this episode is really for. And I just wanted to ask, and it's kind of of a discussion that might be a bit sensitive, but how do you think school boards and schools can better accommodate and help students to reduce mental health challenges and help overcome them, or in a sense try to, as we mentioned, decrease the effects of any mental health challenges or barriers on students before they get to the point where they want to self-harm?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, first of all, the accessibility to things like social workers, for examples, needs to be really thought about, and just the discussion that surrounds it, and perhaps bridging these gaps that might exist between students and social workers at schools. Because I sometimes think about it, and for example, a kid that's born into a rich family that's rich enough to afford kind of specialized social work, healthcare, mental health care type of type of facilities for their kids, they could access therapy as early as they want. Right. It's not like, because, their parents are, of course, going to be like, well, okay, you do seem a little bit down. Hey, let's, maybe you can talk to someone. And then they're going to boom, pay for it. It's done. They're going to therapy. Now, on the other hand, someone who does not have the same financial capacities, right, is going to be left to rely on community resources that they might not know about, and that stigma might exist around these community resources, right? Not knowing about it also necessitates that social work systems within schools, as well as mental health care systems within schools, are spoken about more commonly in the schools themselves. It's not like, oh, there's that odd social worker that's just at their office. And if you happen to know about their existence in the school, then maybe you can just knock at their door and get in. I don't know how it happens these days at schools, but back in my day, right? It
Wow,
didn't. It was
you
like,
had to
no,
do that. You
yeah,
had
right.
to,
Yeah,
huh?
but back in my day, right? It didn't used to be like that, right? I don't like. I do not ever remember walking into the social worker's office and kind of like,
Yeah.
talking to them about my life. Like that's never a thing that I
Mm-mm.
I ever went through,
No.
and that's mainly because I did not know that they existed,
Yeah. And
and I
like,
didn't even know where their office was.
no. And
So
like, I think that like over the past, you know, for this school year at least, I think I've been fortunate enough to have access to a social worker. And that's only because of the recent events. Um, and again, like they're just gonna put a social worker there because of crisis that
mhm.
happened that they played a huge part in. So now all of a sudden there's a social worker everywhere,
Yeah,
that I'm saying, okay, thank you very much. Like I actually, being able to have access to one is really important to me as of right now. But maybe would have been helpful if more students actually knew that, okay, social workers here on these days you can drop in and talk about certain things, maybe not even necessarily needing a referral because you might not feel comfortable enough
Yeah.
going to, your guidance counselor to give you the referral to go speak to a social worker. But having that, like, knowing that a social worker is there, because even in my last years of schooling here in Canada, I've never been to a social worker. This is my first time knowing that I can just drop into a social worker's office. And I feel like their doors were never really like, I never felt like I could just walk in at any time and talk to a social worker. I just felt
Mm.
like, okay, this room is kind of, it feels like if I open it, no one's going to be there to
Yeah.
talk to me about it
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
about certain things that are going on in my life. So, like, I could have graduated this past
Not
summer,
even going
not
to
even
their
going to
office
a social worker.
once. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, like, you don't have to say back in my day because you're not that old, but like, just thinking about it, I probably would have had the same
Yeah.
experience
Yeah.
too.
And I was, I was saying back in my day as a kind of like, just because it's not that long ago, and I'm
Exactly.
100% sure that that's the way it continues to be.
Exactly. It's
That's
really
really
like that.
sad.
It's really
It's
like
really
that.
sad.
It's only until a crisis occurred that all of a sudden a social worker is at Peel schools now.
Coming out of nowhere.
Yeah. And I hope I don't know, hopefully this doesn't reach Peel. But, it is what it is. If it happens, yeah.
Yeah, it's
But
fine. Hey, we love you guys. Maybe, I don't know.
Peel, I'm graduating this year, so maybe just give me a pass. But, like, if it makes a lot of sense, like, they only do stuff when a crisis occurs, and it's really sad, but it's the reality of the situation. So how can improvements be seen? How can we decrease those things? We put in certain specific things that might not necessarily stress students out, understanding where they come from, having teachers that are empathetic, understand certain needs of certain students, that they might need more support within that aspect because of something going on in their life.
Exactly,
So,
exactly, exactly. Yeah, and I think that although yes, it is important that we maintain our educational standards and that students get to learn the stuff that they're supposed to learn as school students, but I think that really opening up that discussion, right, making sure that students know of the fact that these resources exist, normalizing reaching out to these resources in the first place, right, trying to kind of disintegrate many of these toxic structures that exist within schools, right? Trying to really frame the discussion, being like, hey, it is actually normal to be sad. It is actually normal to seek out support,
yeah.
right? It is something that you can do, that I do, for example, let's say, for example, I happen to be like the person talking about, like, it's just making sure that everyone knows that we all need support at one point in time. And it is not a bad thing to reach out to support,
Exactly.
right? Especially within, let's say, networks of immigrant students or newcomer students that might be there. Because again, I think that the stigma that exists in immigrant communities is something that cannot be ignored.
Yeah,
And
100%.
unfortunately, we go like, well, no, I mean, we cannot really talk about that, where we might end up sort of being thought of as like trying to now, like, yeah, immigrant communities face enough already. And then now we're going to start bashing each other and telling each other, like, hey, mental health, and we don't talk about mental health. Like, no, this is actually a problem that exists. And we do not talk about mental health enough in immigrant communities.
No.
And it is stigmatized to the nth degree. Like, it's stigmatized always.
And I think a big part of, like, not talking about those things as immigrants is we're always taught to push through hardships. And this is,
Yeah.
this is just something else that we have to go through. Like, don't be weak. It's literally nothing. Like,
Yeah.
I could give you so many cheesy quotes about working hard and like pushing through, but
Okay.
like,
Mental health, going to therapy, that's white people shit.
yeah,
Yeah. What are you
exactly.
talking about?
Exactly. Like,
That's
you
literally
can't
what it
talk
is.
about that stuff. Are you like, you're not them. You have
No.
to be like, you know, it's actually it's very harmful,
Yeah,
and
it is.
it's really
It
harmful
is. Yeah.
because,
Yeah.
you know, us recognizing it now, we won't necessarily pass it on to the next generation, but understanding that this is something that was like is generational. It was passed down to from family to family,
Yeah.
and it was taught. Like you're taught
Hmm.
not to speak about certain
Hmm.
things. You're taught not to talk about your personal life. You can't throw your life out there. That's not good, right? And you have to be private, blah blah blah, right? And in some cases, obviously you don't tell people everything in your life, but when you have to talk about certain things, and if that makes you feel better, if that helps you get through another day, then that's the most important part about it.
100%. 100%.
So with that being said, um, today's podcast was kind of a difficult one to make. I think that um, remembering Jay and what he did for this podcast will always be something pinnacle in this podcast. He was the person that came up with the idea, messaged me, and we kind of went from there. And that only happened about 2 years ago. So for that, I'm really thankful. I'm really thankful I met a person like Jay, helping me, helping us, uh, get this podcast to where it is now.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. And I think like, this really speaks to the person that Jay was.
yeah, exactly.
He was a person that cared about community. He knew that many immigrants and newcomers face issues that 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 could only be improved by having that platform where people could speak about it. And he wished to actually create that platform, and he did create that platform
Yep.
through the very existence of this podcast. So I think that will remain his legacy. And we really, really are going to try our hardest to make sure that this platform that he created, along with Malik, kind of exists and continues to be there as a support system for newcomers and immigrants, um, as they kind of like navigate the many struggles that immigrants and newcomers here in this country and in many other countries face.
100%. Perfectly put.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, with that being said, thank you to everyone for listening to today's episode. We hope you listen more and keep up with our podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all. Stay tuned. Bye.